Hello and welcome back. Up until this point, we have covered the physical basis of climate change, what it is, why it happens, how the atmosphere, the cryosphere, the biosphere, the geosphere all interact to create the climate that we live with. Now in Unit 2, we are moving into the so what, how do we deal with it, the impacts, the adaptation, the vulnerability, what are we doing with this? The first topic is going to be aquatic systems, looking in our water, how the water is changing and how the life in the water that we eat is changing. All righty, so getting into it, the natural and managed resources and systems and their uses, looking first at freshwater aquatic systems. Now, climate change is projected to reduce renewable surface water and groundwater resources significantly in most dry subtropical regions, right? As we've talked about, the wet get wetter, the dry get drier. So places that are already dry subtropical regions are going to get even drier. This is going to impact the amount of surface water, such as lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, and the groundwater that we use to pump out, drink, use agriculturally, industrially. Looking at this map, you can see the places that are hit hardest are in the subtropical regions, especially around the Mediterranean Sea, along the southern tips of South America, Africa, and Australia. Here where we aren't hit the hardest, but it's not looking great. It's looking like we're going to experience between a 0 and negative 30% change in our groundwater. Well, that's been the change in the past, so 1980 to 2010. And that trend is looking like it's going to continue into the future. All right, talking about droughts. So climate change is likely to increase the frequency of meteorological droughts, meaning there's going to be less rainfall in places that are already dry, and agricultural droughts. That means that it's not just the rainfall that's going to decrease, but also the soil moisture, the water that the plants actually need to grow. And this is under the RCP 8.5 scenario. So this is worst case scenario, right? We think droughts are going to get much worse. However, as we know, we are not actually headed down the path of the worst case scenario. And there are many actions that we can take in order to continue to decrease our impact on this hydrologic system. So what are the impacts here, right? If we have less rainfall and less soil moisture in areas that are already dry, it's going to intensify competition for water among agriculture, ecosystems, settlements, industry, and energy production, right? This is going to affect regional water, energy, and food security. Now, we do have limited evidence for this. That's because this hasn't happened to a large scale yet. There are some places that are already undergoing these changes, but it's often hard to tease apart what is due to climate change versus what is due to just human consumption. So, for example, right, this is Lake Mead. This is the lake that is created by the Hoover Dam. It is what flows through much of the southwest, or the drainage basin that flows through much of the southwestern US through the Colorado River. And many states and many tribes all share this water that comes out of this lake. You can see that the lake elevation has varied a lot since the early 1900s when the Hoover Dam was built. But if you look just at the more recent times, so since the late 1900s, you can see that we have gone from a maximum of lake elevation around 1,200 feet, and we've plummeted all the way down to record low levels, approaching just in the low 1,000 feet. Now, there's still a lot of water here, right? It's not like we are out of water. There still is a lot of water. We are just looking at the trends and noticing that if we keep on this downward trajectory, we will eventually run out of water. And right now, all these different states and all these different tribal nations currently have agreements that say, this state gets this much for agriculture, this nation gets this much for drinking, this state gets this much, and so on and so on. And they've noticed that those agreements, if they continue to use how much each entity has been promised, they will eventually run out of water. So they're having to renegotiate those agreements to keep that water more sustainable. And again, right, much of this is due to climate change. A lot of this water is fed by snowmelt. So the less cold we have, the less precipitation we have, the less snowmelt we're going to have coming down into this lake. But it's also from human overconsumption, right? We are living in a very, very dry area that requires us to extract a lot of water from this system. So because of that, right, climate change is intensifying competition in the West. Right? States and tribes in the Colorado Basin are legally entitled to 15 million acre feet of water per year, with another 1.5 million going to Mexico, right? Obviously, we don't want to dry up the river entirely before it gets to Mexico. Many, many years we do. If you go down to the mouth of the Colorado River, there is no river left in many dry seasons. It's just a dry riverbed, right? So all of this water is promised, but only about 12.4 million acre feet of water has flowed in over the last 2 decades. So obviously we are promised and using more water than is actually coming into the system, which is why the lake levels in Lake Mead are plummeting so quickly. So in regions with snowfall, we think that climate change has altered observed stream flow season. Excuse me. In regions with snowfall, climate change has altered observed stream flow seasonally, right? This is definitely happening in Lake Colorado and Lake Mead. That's where it gets a lot of its water, but it's not the only place. Places like California also gets a lot of their water from that seasonal snow melt, the seasonal ice melt. And we can tell that during the winter, the flows are actually increasing because rather than falling as snow where that water is preserved in ice, it's just falling as water because of the higher temperatures and very quickly flowing off the landscape, flowing away and being lost. This means that during the spring, there's smaller snowmelt floods. So we have more water flowing during winter, but less water flowing during spring, and even less water flowing during the summer, because this is when typically all that snow would melt and flow into the rivers. But now the snow never fell in the first place, or at least less snow fell in the first place. So the time of year when we really, really need that water, the summer, when it's dry, when it's hot, when we're producing agriculture, that's when we don't have the water. Whereas in the wintertime, when it's already cold, when we already have plenty of water, when we're not using it for agriculture, that's when we do have the water. So we're creating, climate change is creating this imbalance where the seasonal change in flow is no longer working for us. This means that water shortages are causing issues in many, many places. Here we're focusing on the Western US. These are just a lot of news headlines. One says water shortages and fires loom after a dry winter, right? So not only are we running out of water, our forests are drying up, causing more wildfires. Another one says with no snow and night, Denver water gives winter watering tips, right? So people are actually having to change their day-to-day lifestyles, right? Since we have less water, places are saying, well, you can only water your lawn this often, or you can only use this much water in industrial uses, things like that. Another one is saying why snow, not water, is what's needed to stop Arizona's drought. Again, it's that seasonal flux of water where ideally it would fall as ice, as snow, and be preserved, be maintained on the mountaintops before being released in the hotter months down to us. And right now that's not happening. And finally, 7 weeks of near record low snowfall in the Colorado River Basin have water managers worried. Lake Powell is the reservoir, the lake just above Lake Mead, and experiencing many, many, many of the same problems. So, right, if you are interested in policy, if you are interested in interstate agreements, this is something to focus on in the coming decades.